This is A Geek Leader. Hey guys, John Ryder back again with episode 68 of A Geek Leader podcast, and it is October. October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So we're going to have a little bit of security this month, but it's also Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And I wanted to, instead of telling everybody to go and subscribe, give me a rating and review and all those good things, to head over to ageekleader.com/breast cancer, and that redirects you to the National Breast Cancer Society, so you guys can make a donation there. That would be greatly appreciated. But also in October, I want to have some powerful women on the podcast talking about women in tech, talking about their experiences and what it's like to learn leadership at their level. And to kick things off today, we're going to have Michelle Dennedy. Michelle Dennedy is the Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer at Cisco Systems. So with all that being said, give it up for Michelle Dennedy.
Thank you, John. It's good to be here.
All right. If you don't mind telling the audience just a little bit about how you got started in technology, how you got into the privacy arena or that field of technology, and where you are now.
Yeah, it was kind of an accident, to be honest with you. I've always been interested in applied technology. I have a degree, a Bachelor of Sciences in psychology with a minor in economics from Ohio State, and I volunteered for a robotics lab where we were using applied technology to train handicapped children in science. And we saw huge gains psychologically, of course, and educationally, and also with the technology, where people actually can use technology to solve real world barriers and challenges. And so I went on from there and got a law degree and practiced in the patent law field for several years before falling really face first into technology and moved out here to Silicon Valley, where I live now. And the privacy issue was really heating up, but in a very quiet little corner of the world, where we recognized once again that we had a wave of technology, distributed computing, IoT as we're calling it now, and cloud computing were just getting started when I got in the field. And there was an obvious implication for ethics and privacy there. And so even though it was a very unpopular notion, and many of the tech leaders and pioneers were saying, technology is going to eat our human rights and take away our right to determine the stories that we want to tell about ourselves, I just thought, I'm going a different way. I'm going to go double hands down on this new form of intellectual property called privacy. And so that's how I ended up in the field. And I've been in a lot of infrastructure companies, a little bit of consumer work along the way. And so now I'm at Cisco, and our primary function, on top of the obvious compliance work that we do as just a part of running a good, clean, ethical, legal business, is my team really looks at privacy engineering and data valuation. And so we are looking for the next frontier of privacy and data and big data and artificial intelligence in privacy and in human rights management.
So what exactly is privacy engineering? Like, how does that fall into, I guess, what is that exactly?
It's a great question. So there's a public policy principle and now a legal principle in many jurisdictions called privacy by design. And it's really 7 different points talking about building in privacy protections for users and consumers and those observed by technology from the very beginning. And so the policy and the outcome that we want is privacy being designed in. We don't want a zero-sum game where there is a false notion that you have to have security or privacy, convenience or privacy, safety or privacy. Instead, we really look at how do we integrate the value of having self-determination, having the ability to have permissioned and authorized processing of our personal data according to fair, moral, legal, and ethical principles. And so privacy engineering is the really newly formed branch of discipline, study, and application that looks at all the various tools, how to create technology that's privacy enhancing, how to launch privacy enhancing technology, how to live with and govern that technology, as well as how to engineer a means to get to a return on your investment once you've taken the time to look at a data-centric, people-first network, how do you actually use that to run a better business and a better government or a better NGO, whatever your organization or application is? Privacy engineering, as in every other field of engineering, looks at the tools available, looks at the challenges, and solves a problem.
Yeah, I know when I think back of my early days as a web and then eventually mobile development manager before I took my current role, we always kind of was always under the gun to get an application out or get a new product out, and it was almost like privacy was, oh, that's a nice to have once you hit the release date. That's phase 2 is to build in the privacy. I like the idea of designing first for privacy.
Yeah, you're not really going to get very far. And same thing with security. If you build a faulty application with faulty logic, or an application that's going to spew information every which way but loose, and then suddenly you try to draw a fence around it for security, most times you're going to fail. Maybe you'll keep it a little bit dampened down, but if you think about it in the beginning and make sure that it's purpose-driven, you understand the materials you have, you understand the outcomes that you have, then building in privacy is actually not easy is the wrong word to choose. It's selective, it's purpose-driven, and it creates a lot of value for that application.
Yeah, I like the word purpose-driven, that you're doing it for a reason.
Yeah, it's not a nice to have to make lawyers happy. It's really not.
Well, I know that's one thing that's where I'm at now, and some of the things we've talked about at my company is GDPR. It's kind of a big deal. And how does your role as a chief privacy officer fall into GDPR?
Yeah, so so GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, has just been really driven into force. And as of May 25th, 2018, we had a 2-year ramp up to get ready, we being the world. So basically, if you are doing business in the European Union or implicating people who are present in the European Union, not just your European citizens, that's a absolutely false piece of data. It's directed at European humans or people who are in Europe doing European things. But that said, that piece of regulation is really an attempt to harmonize the law of the land in Europe since 1995. Now, it's not just Europe. It really has its tentacles spread out all over the place. We're a global company. GDPR is interesting to a lot of people now because it has these giant fines attached, up to 4% of global turnover. For a company like ours, that can be millions and millions of dollars for failing to protect the information of citizens and those present within the European Union, or directed traffic that is directed to or intended to include European data. So you're talking about a law that is in place for a certain geographic area of the world that has tentacles and enforcement capabilities around the world. And Europe is not the only one. We've seen laws like this coming out of Kenya. We've got one coming out of Brazil with 18 months runway there to get up to speed in their version of a GDPR. And even the state of California has enacted a California privacy rule that looks and smells and walks and talks a lot like the General Data Protection Regulation. So this is a trend that won't go away. It's a new day for data, where we look at data and the protection of data and the purpose-driven functionality of data about other human beings in the same way that we're looking at food safety, medical devices, medical safety, pharmaceutical development, things that impact individuals at the most cellular level, so to speak. And the cellular level in your digital world is your privacy.
Yeah, I think all these rules are going to benefit, at least in my opinion, I think these are definitely going to benefit our children and our grandchildren. But what about us? What about folks that our data is kind of already out there in certain cases? How do these retroactively affect us or help us out if we've already been all over Facebook and Twitter and social media in general? We've already posted a bunch of stuff out there. How do these rules kind of apply for us?
So while you can't necessarily wipe your slate entirely clean, although there's a notion, and I'll say it's a notion because we don't quite know how to functionalize a quote-unquote right to be forgotten. The world has never been able to forget. Our stories are told, and the more unusual or remarkable, they're told again and again. So the fact that many people have shared a lot of their information publicly or have had their information stolen from them by organizations that didn't have an entitlement to use it or changed their use of information and used it in a different or unexpected way. Those may be breaches of the law, but that information is, as you've said, it's already out there. So what does this mean? And can we get back a semblance of control? And I think the answer is yes, of course. I'm deeply biased. I think privacy engineering is the mechanism. I'm deeply biased there as well. But I believe that if we start to look at the data asset as we do currency, so I may have spent all my money and lost all my money. That doesn't mean I say, oh, currency is dead, money is dead. No, I figure out a better way to manage my money going forward. I get more money coming in, a new story that's told about yourself and your activities. And I try to protect that information, hopefully in a little more wise and studied and purposeful fashion.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what is something that me as a tech leader or team leaders that manage small development teams or infrastructure teams, what is it we should be thinking about or learning about as far as privacy is concerned?
So I think, again, I'm deeply biased, so you'll hear it from me again
so
and again.
Everything, right?
You should learn about privacy engineering. You should learn about how to set, I think the first stage is, way back in engineering school or even way back in your garage as you started becoming aware and building applications or even gaming, you figure out how the course of play runs. What are the rules of the game? So it doesn't mean that you have to, as a technical person, turn into a lawyer, but you certainly have to understand the requirements and the reason that you're building your widget in the first place. So whether that widget is a cloud service, online distributed network, or the smallest of apps that simply says, yo, and that's the only functionality it has, hypothetically, of course. I don't even think that app exists anymore, but it was funny when it did. It doesn't matter where you are in the development paradigm, whether you're acquiring, you're building, or you're designing. Start with a requirements workshop. Think about all the stakeholders that want information to flow from point A to point B for some reason. Do you understand the reason? The reason will show you the way. So are you collecting people's work histories because you're curating a large network of people that have similar interests and you want to link them in? That's one type of design, and you need that information to be shared. But you may not want to have every piece of negative criticism from a manager to be shared in that professional network. In contrast, you may want to have a just-in-time signal. So I've fallen down on the pavement. It looks like there's a bone sticking out of my leg. I want to very quickly, efficiently, and correctly transmit that I have an allergy to penicillin or sulfa drug. I want to make sure that I'm not going to show up at the hospital sicker than when I came in. That transaction isn't something permanently there so I can network with other broken leg people. That information is for a limited period of time for the purposes of emergency prevention of harm or the promotion of a treatment for me or whatever. So as I'm thinking through these various data scenarios, you're thinking through the professional thing of what do I need? But then you should also be thinking the data centricity. What would it be if I was better informed to do this task? Or would it make sense to be presented with this information with the requirement for efficiency and speed? So I may not need to burden the folks in the ambulance about my insurance status. In fact, I may not want to do that for ethical or discriminatory purposes. They may not need to know whether I'm going to be able to pay for the services later. The exigency in time is something different. So as I think through and I talk through and I imagine all the various people that could have access to the system I'm looking at, create it, risk test it, having a mental pen testing before you even begin, that's how a scoping workshop happens. And it can happen for applications very large on a grand scale, as well as the smallest applications. And I will posit to you that even your smallest applications eventually will sit on or interact with the largest of applications. So the better you are at curating your data today, i.e. becoming a privacy engineer, the more valuable that tool becomes in the future, because you know what you have, you know what you don't have, you can anticipate a lot of the risk, and then when the unknowns happen, you can take stuff off the table that was already planned for, because you know that this is a known unknown. So in planning and having scoping workshops and realizing, spending that upfront time of just thinking through on the positive side, the asset side, what would the information do to impact, create power, create protection, create efficacy, and then the downside risk. Who would want to steal it once it was curated well? Once that information did acquire value, once that information was able to impact a human being because it was telling the story rightly or wrongly about that human being. That's the essence of beginning the path down privacy engineering and quality.
Wow, that's a good story to tell. And it's something that I think needs to be taught to computer science majors early on. Because a lot of people, myself included, when I was in school, we were trying to build something and get something out there, and the implications of having someone register for an account or create an account and put that data into our systems, and what does that mean that we have to store that data securely? We have to be responsible with that data. Was something that I know I never even thought about until well after I was out of college.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on something really important, John. Is like, how much required time are lawyers being taught how to think about what would actually be the boundaries of technological capabilities? I should no more be able to walk in and tell you that I need an instant snapshot of your entire architecture at all times in all places. If that's not even possible, then you should be able to come in and tell your users, I have no plan to protect your data. I have no plan to charge you for my application. I have no plan to do anything but sell this and hope to God that some advertiser wants it. That's bad business as well as bad privacy.
Yes, it is, but it seems like that's kind of been the plan for a lot of companies to get started that way.
Yeah, and I hear it all the time, and it's like the world is your beta test. And, I do think that is kind of the Wild West of development, but I also think that things are now changing where, you saw in the 1980s. The 1980s is, 50 plus years after the stock market crash and the SEC laws were put into place to protect investors and create transparency in a financial market. And along came Warren Buffett in the 70s and 80s, and he said, this is the top 10 types of things that I will invest in. And a lot of the things were not just, do you have money, do you have customers? They were things like, do you have purpose? Do you have leadership? Do you have transparency? And so we're now looking at this. The web started to be a commercial place in the early 90s and early late 90s when we really geared up and turned into this giant bubble. But it's not going to go away as a commercial as well as governmental platform. And we're looking at it in many parts of the world. I mean, ask my 12-year-old. She'll tell you that having Wi-Fi is some sort of a human right. Now we're looking at a society where we can say, listen, in addition to being a large company that provides the network all over the planet, we also acquire companies all the time. And I think we can now safely say, if you don't know where your data is, and if you don't know how it is or is not being breached, for example, I don't want to buy your dirty laundry. Go wash your clothes. So if you want to sell stuff to bigger companies and your plan is to exit, then you're going to want to do privacy engineering, ethical engineering, and think through your data plan in advance. If your plan as an application developer is to exit as a public company, you have an even greater responsibility, because the transparency that we seek so that we can do basic compliance and hopefully asset creation and privacy is the same type of data you're going to want to use when you're doing your public filing and then eventually share with the SEC. So if you want to create value, you better know what your assets are. And your assets, when you're designing things, are data and the ability to push, stop, or delete information.
So do you think privacy education or just a company having a chief privacy officer as yourself would help several of these stories that I've heard in the news recently of unsecured Amazon AWS buckets and things like that, where people's data gets accidentally leaked out?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I can't speak to any one individual breach because I just don't know what went down there. But I think in many cases, the negligent breaches or the quote unquote unanticipated breaches of today could have been prevented, could have been anticipated. And it's not a giant tax on the development process. I think if we start with early education and we have the processes in place, we'll start to see it just becoming a natural part. We hope in privacy engineering land, even though we launched the Privacy Engineers Manifesto in 2014 and started using the term privacy engineering as the tool set to promote privacy by design. We hope that eventually, within my lifetime, certainly, it stops being called privacy engineering. It stops being called security engineering. It's just a part of being an engineer. It's part of being a problem solver to understand where the basic functionalities of your systems lie. It's not being taught as consistently across computer science programs or law programs or UX designer programs. But I can see a place in the future very quickly that we're going to need these types of tools and the skill set and jobs so that people are really thinking, what is an asset? Is it really just money? Or is it now stories about people, information that people want, and how do I get it to them?
Yeah, I think that shift in perspective of what is an asset is pretty important, and understanding that, just understanding someone's usage on an application can be very valuable, especially on how you build that application going forward. But also, if someone wanted to start a new company or build a new application, they can look at your usage patterns to model that, to find out what the best ways to build things. So yeah, data is extremely important and extremely valuable, and I think the notion of protecting it is something that we should have been thinking about for, much longer ago than we are today.
Yeah, I think so too. But I think a couple of things. One is better late than never. For 1,000 years they used lead in their cosmetics and slowly poisoned themselves to death. We don't do that now as much as we can. And now we know better about how we create value. And you put your finger on it, John, exactly, is what if you were competing with another app that didn't have a means or an ethical way of studying its own usage patterns? Imagine now going in and doing a bake-off with one of your competitors. If you have insight and they're running blind because they can't or won't, or their only means of getting data is to sneak it because they haven't planned for it, to spy on their own users who are giving them and driving, hopefully, growth and value, then think about those two competitors. Which is the one that you would pay for, either to acquire that company or to use that service? And that's where I think the competitive side of this starts to kick in, and we start to see, until we get ubiquity, we will have innovation and competition.
Yeah, that's good. I want to shift gears just a little bit and ask you just how you got into the role of Chief Privacy Officer. Like, what was the leadership things that you had to learn about, or what skills did you have to have in order to get into a role like that?
So this is kind of a cautionary tale of do as I say, not as I've done. So for me, the role of Chief Privacy Officer happened really on 9/11, 2001. So I was, we all have our stories. And I had a 6-day-old daughter in my arms. I was working for a company called Sun Microsystems, doing privacy work as an attorney. And right after the murders, a couple of things happened. First, I watched my friends dying on TV. To say that's unpleasant is an understatement. But I knew the names of some of the people that were dying because my roommate was at Cantor Fitzgerald, and I was watching and looking at where the plane hit and what floor they hit. So immediately I had a visceral reaction that was connected to not just horrible international event, but also a very personal, grounded issue of like, oh my gosh, who showed up to work today? Individual granular data stories that ended that moment. And then that evening on the news, you hear from tech leaders talking about pooling data, privacy's dead, we need more, blah, blah, blah. And this is before the 9/11 Commission came out and said, hey, by the way, we had all the risk data we needed. We didn't share it. We didn't gain insight. And we didn't listen to the many whistleblowers who were running around saying, this isn't normal. This threat exists. The reality of this hits. These are the people that are not taking landing seriously, but they're taking flying very seriously. So we had enough data. It wasn't a lack of data. It wasn't a lack of insight. It was a lack of process. It was a lack of trusted sharing in the right corridors at the right time. So it was a lack of timeliness, a lack of efficiency, a lack of quality. And then I looked at that and I said, I can't live in a world with this new infant child that says to her, your story is irrelevant. We've just lost 3,000 people and all the families that were impacted and all the friends that were impacted. None of their stories are relevant now because we've had this failure. And I just said, hell no. And so I got together with my business partner. We wrote up a business plan and said, this is no longer a cute little privacy policy because of these laws. This is now our fight against the very long-term generational harms that are done by disregarding individual self-determination through data, the ability to tell your own story, the ability to manage your own communications from human to human or human to government or government to citizen. And so that was the beginning of the business plan. And I took it to my CEO at the time, who was none other than Scott McNeely, who very famously had said, you have zero privacy, get over it. So here I am, a young lawyer, not an executive, crazed, filled with baby hormones, running in and telling one of the lions of technology, Sun Microsystems, that they had got it wrong and I was going to help them fix it. And Scott, to his everlasting credit, who still to this day will tell you that privacy is over. He's a hard case. I'm working on him hard. He turned around and he said to me, literally, here's some rope. Go hang yourself, kid. And that was the beginning of everything. So I reached out to people who were far more senior and said, I need to be a senior executive and play with the big boys. And I don't have any experience. Teach me what you know. I went and got some great mentors from my industry and well outside of my industry, because I knew that had I stayed and just listened to the quote unquote wisdom in my industry, privacy was already gone. It was a matter of getting away with it and compliance. So by getting out and talking to people in pharmaceutical and talking to people in automotive safety and talking to people in environmental safety, big, hairy, data-enriched problems, it was possible for me to change my thinking and say, let's look at this. And then the final step was no closer than home. I called my dad. My dad's been a security and IT architect since the 1950s and punched cards and mainframes. And I said, Dad, I've got this problem. And as dads do, he says, okay, let's work to fix it. And so he's a co-author on our book, The Privacy Engineer's Manifesto. What are the things that engineers know how to do? Well, we look at tools and we solve problems. So I have a problem and we had some tools, data modeling, scoping workshops, UML, process planning, waterfall design, agile design, DevSecOps. And we put all those things together and we said, now someone's got to pay for it and people are going to believe this is way too much overhead. So we started studying the data and realizing how much efficiency and value and quality was driven by a people-centric, data-centric network. And that's how it all has gone down. And, you know, I still haven't learned my craft yet. I don't think I'll ever learn my craft. It's a constant state of practice and I make a new mistake every day.
Yeah,
hopefully not the same mistake twice.
I think that's the mindset that we need to have just as leaders in general, is that there is no destination. It's just the journey.
Exactly. And it's a hell of a ride.
It is.
It's a lot of fun.
What was it like writing a book with your dad?
Oh my gosh. Happy when it was done, for sure. It was a very surreal experience. So Jonathan Fox is our third co-author, and he has been my business partner for 4 different companies now. Poor guy. And, you know, you can imagine what it was like for him. Like, here's his boss and the boss's dad. And my dad is classic engineer dude, you know, came out of the Navy's training center and was working on mainframes in Vietnam, you know, back in the, not in the country, but during that state of war. So he learned when there were big things at stake. So he's a curmudgeonly guy and a very sarcastic and harsh guy. And here I am, the comic goofball that I am. So coming together and creating a common voice was generation to generation, male, female, all the family stuff, the hardcore practitioner of quote unquote hard science of math and technical with the softer psychology and law. My dad is also a lawyer. He went to night school on the GI Bill. But it was the result of a lot of those synergies, and none of those synergies, and I think this is something you and I talked about briefly, is in the inclusion field. It's not about getting different looking people in a room and like taking a photo op. Inclusion is those days I went home and I was like, how did I decide to write this book with my crazy ass dad? He's driving me nuts. He thinks he's always right. He always gets to be right because he's my dad. And here's my poor Jonathan trying to be a referee who also has his own opinions about my stuff and my dad's stuff. So it's that process of tearing your hair out and thinking the other person is absolutely out of their mind and then pausing and letting it in. It's a mistake to dismiss someone's opinion that you think is violently wrong. You have to do that self-examination and say, that thing is illegal. We can't do that. It's cross-border. And then you have to go, what if he was right? The thing that I was most violently opposed to was the thing I had to get curious about. Yeah. And that curiosity takes you to a solution that you wouldn't get to without that irritation. So we will irritate each other as we make it a more diverse culture, but we will make it better in the same way. So being an executive for a technology company as a female, how does that, how do you feel about this whole women in tech movement that we've heard people talk about? And I actually have someone coming on the show. Their episode will be live just before this one, who's running a camp for middle school girls to teach them development engineering, which I think is a fantastic nonprofit. And this was a developer who came from Apple, who worked at Apple and left that to start this camp, which is pretty awesome. But I wanted to get your take of what we can do, what IT managers, directors, and other leaders can help do, if there's anything we can do to try to open our arms and saying, it's okay to have anybody in tech. I know one of the things that I do is whenever I get a resume, I don't even look at the name until I've decided whether I want to interview this person or not. Excellent. Step one. I love it. That's step one. Very minimum, I'd say. But what can we do to help encourage women, kids in general, just to think about technology as a career? Yeah, I love it, and I don't think it's a simple step because we automatically have that bias. Both of my children have neutral names, so if you got their resume, you wouldn't know if they were a man or a woman immediately, and I did that intentionally, knowing the upwinds that I have faced in my career for sure. I think first of all, I love what you're doing. You're going credentials first. I'm going to look at what the qualifications are for the job. The second step is a little more nuanced because the things that you're female, and I'm way overgeneralizing, it's not true for everyone, but many, 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 many women are trained to be nice, to be cooperative, to be solution finders, etc. So when you're looking at their resume, they're saying things like assisted and helped with and was part of. The same activity from a different candidate will say led, drove, completed. And you will read these words and not even know that you're being biased. And they have written them not even knowing that the females are feeling like they're being honest because no one at any sort of company has done it alone. Even if you have a single partner, it is assisted and helped with and was guided. It wasn't, ran, executed, and whatever. So it's a linguistic difference that matters. As you get further and further along your career, those linguistic styles become even more assumptive and repetitive. So I think the one thing that men have to realize is I was shocked at how much they were shocked by Me Too. I think men have to get a lot more curious about this inclusion problem. What is it in my own thinking that I'm not getting? Was I surprised to hear about all this stuff? Do I think for a moment that teenage shenanigans when they amount to a crime are just teenage shenanigans? Or do I really think that this is something that, gosh, if if my instant instinct is like, they were just kids, could it be that I've been dismissing someone else who's been carrying that burden with them? Just had a Twitter conversation over the weekend with a woman who was talking about how she behaves at conferences. It never crossed my mind that there weren't men who have had women follow them to their rooms and try to get in, to have like whatever conversation or whatever. But it happens to women all the time. I'm now a middle-aged old biddy, and it still happens to me. When I was a little young thing, all the time. I'm not at RSA to get a date. I'm there to do security stuff. I'm not, at a corporate tech conference. I mean, I love the self-flattery that must go on. It's like, sweetheart, if I was looking for some bohunk to have anonymous sex with, do you think I'm coming to a tech convention? Okay. So I think thing number one is just be aware that your experience professionally has been very different than the people around you. That's number one. Number two is I've been telling women how to lean into stuff, how to get stronger, how to shrug things off, how to have a thicker skin, how to try to be more assertive. And I say this to them because I'm trying to say it to myself. I don't do these things for myself. I'll be the first to admit it. I don't ask for a raise. I don't say this is my project. I say assisted with and helped and led. But I don't assert. There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with these women. That is their truth. What we have to do is get more men to be allies. If men are being a jerk, we need you to take that same risk. I can't tell you how many men have said to me and women have said to me, well, that guy was obviously hitting on you. Why didn't you punch him? I've never thought about asking a man who was witnessing the same thing, why didn't you create a criminal act to deflect that behavior? I don't go around committing crimes, and it's not terribly good for my career either. And if you question the uncomfortable nice guys around the table, they know who the assholes are. They're not acting either because they've got the same fears that the woman has, that they're going to be upset in their career and get off track. So it's not blaming anyone. It's really looking out to have your teammates back. So as you're getting curious about their perspectives and why they have it, everyone, and not just men, but men are a little late to this party, should really be looking to say, how do I enable these good ideas and help that person get out of their way in a way that works for them? Don't tell them to be something they're not, assertive, fake men, because those are the women that I had as role models growing up. They all had the steel polyester blouse with a bow choking them off, and they all tried to act like stereotypical men. And men aren't even that way. Like, are you out there like tearing raw meat with your teeth every morning? Yeah. I hope not. It's not very healthy. So I think there's a lot that can be done. And I think the benefit for the industry is better usability, better sustainability, more interesting work and more interesting, challenging dialogue about how to solve problems when we include diverse perspectives.
I agree 100%. And I think that was very well said. I want to be conscious of your time, so I want to ask just one more question. What is one thing that you would say new leaders, somebody who aspires to be a technical leader should be focusing on or thinking about that they might not learn in school or might not have learned yet on the job?
I think if you are lucky enough to lead, and particularly lead other people, the number one thing that you will grow the most from is, well, I'll say number one, and I'll follow up with the number two, even though you don't ask for one. I think number one is humility. You're trained to be the best. You're trained to get on top. You're trained to get that promotion, and someone else is not getting it because you're getting it, or get that job. And that involves a lot of winning. And what you have to understand is that was a compromise for someone. Your winning was a compromise. It could be that you were just nudging out someone who had a totally different take on it or a different talent that you don't have. Stay humble about that. What would you do to be that better candidate that would be the perfect candidate, as opposed to the one that got it and was fortunate to get it, even if you earned it? So stay humble about your own weaknesses. And recognize that you cannot ever get out of your own perspective. So that's where my thing number 2 is curiosity. Be curious about the problems that you have solved as well as the ones that you have not. Why are they still there? Be a 4-year-old. Why does that exist? Why do people like it? Why do people like me? Be curious.
That's really good. That's really good advice. I think the humility thing, that's one thing that I struggle with, is empathy in general, and trying to put that in when I'm having one-on-ones or leading teams, and just being humble and realizing that I'm only here because of the people around me.
Exactly.
So that's really, really good advice. Well, thank you so much for your time. How can people connect with you on Twitter or find out more about the things that you're doing over at Cisco?
So I am so findable. So you can find me on Twitter yakking away about privacy, data, ethics, and all sorts of things at @mdennedy, Dennedy. And we have a great podcast called the Privacy Sigma Writers. And you can go to trust.cisco.com or Google Play, Apple, wherever you get your podcast on. And we come out every other Tuesday with all sorts of, as the title implies, Sigma writers are for the weird and wacky. So if you're just looking for a legal podcast, I'll tweet stuff at you. But this is for really, hopefully, things that will tweak your brains a little bit, make you think, hopefully make you laugh a little bit. So come and find me, come and chat, and help me grow.
Yeah, we'll definitely link those up in the show notes. And I think I've heard you say before that you're one of the most public chief privacy officers out there.
Yeah, if you define privacy as secrecy, I long ago have abandoned it. If you define it as staking your own claim and being your own unique person, I feel I can humbly submit to you that I do my best.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, John. Have a great day.
You too.